Welcome and thank you for joining me for today's theory video into the fall of Tartaria. I thought it was important to look at how Tartaria could have fallen. We've talked about it before and after the reset. We've never really looked though at what the civilization looked like aside from a few vision photos. Today though, I want to consider the theories for how it fell. But to start off, I want to share the approach of the channel. The channel seeks to explore these theories to prove or disprove them. Always maintain objectivity, the hardest part. Reveal and share details of the land with all viewers. Encourage you to seek your own answers, and keep asking questions and we will find the truth. Let's go back to the 5 eras theory, which is what we're looking at. And today we're going to be focusing exclusively on the Tartarian Age, or the civilization that preceded ours, in the 4th era. Recall that it's surrounded by the Golden Age, which we believe consisted of 3 eras, or at least the channel has theorized that, and then followed by our current contemporary age, also derisively called the Plastic Age, the Disposable Age by other researchers, which I certainly agree with. We don't know how long the Tartarian Age truly lasted. It could have been a few hundred years, it could have been a few thousand years, it could have been over 10,000 years. What we know is they had incredible accomplishments in architecture, society, and civilization. And oftentimes we're derided for even suggesting such theories because we are told and reassured that our civilization is the pinnacle of humanity. Yet we see so much evidence that contradicts that when we look at images of what Tartaria could have looked like. And yes, I'll admit Tartaria is a term that we use to refer to the civilization before us. It has many different names. We're expected to believe that there was a civilization called Rome that lasted 1,000 years despite being very corrupt and despite every significant leader in that civilization betraying the other leader. Yet when we look at this civilization of Tartaria, our imaginations are inspired, our hearts are lifted, because in every depiction of it we see a society that managed to work together and achieve balance in a way that we really can't imagine. And when we say achieving balance, what do we mean? Is that just a plug line? Is that just a saying? No. What we see is a civilization that achieved balance between the society and the individual. There was a great society, and yet at the same time, it did care and nurture for the individual. That is the true balance that we see. And this is how you can explain different civilizations, different cultures with different languages working together and achieving a common civilization, because there was a mutual understanding between the goods of society and the good of the individual. There was always something given and something returned on both sides. And we look at what their achievements were and could have been, and we see the remnants of it even today in our own civilization. And that's why we ask these questions. This is something that inspires us just to think about their achievements and how far their society and their civilization really could have gone. It's not just architecture, though. There are still remnants of this everywhere within our own civilization. Many people struggle to accept this, and they will certainly deny it and deride it in any way that they can. Yet, if your eyes are open, you'll see that so much of it remains. Just imagine living in that kind of civilization, one that really cared for the individual as much as the individual cared for society. That was the true balance. We have to wonder if the story or myth of the Tower of Babel was not simply about the languages being confused. Perhaps it was really about the understanding between people and the balance being confused. And that was where the real breakdown started. In this video, we're seeking to explain who or what was responsible for the fall of this incredible civilization. And this is something that compels us in all this research. This video is based on theory and conjecture because ultimately none of us know. The records are lost. We don't have something of an account that we can truly rely on. We have to go off of our research. We have to compare and contrast all the clues that we find. And there are still many clues that you can go out and interact with today physically. There are accounts in the myth, and then of course examining the historical accounts that were given. There's also a bit of a blending between what's real, what may be considered fantasy, and what you can still go interact with, such as the Great Water Tower column that still exists in St. Louis today, in the middle. And yet you compare and contrast those with a fantasy rendering on the left and then what's supposed to be a concept architectural rendering on the right. Yet for some reason all this feels real. All of this seems like it's something that could have existed and could have been a part of our actual history. And once again, people will deny this and say, well, it's just a water tower. There's nothing special about it. So what if it's over 150 feet tall? Yet we look at other conceptualized drawings in our imagination where we see large hangars and incredible technology, inspired by what's called steampunk. Yet somehow it feels so familiar to us, as though this is something that truly existed in our own history. It doesn't seem like it's that disconnected. We also see the incredible hangars and the remarkable buildings that could have contained such devices. We also have so much imagination for the different methods of travel that could have been used and connected such a civilization. Travel on the ground, travel in the air, travel below ground, with many different means, whether it was airships or other aspects that we can't even imagine. Some of these structures clearly still remain, with all the Union stations and their tall ceilings and all their incredible hardened construction on the inside with materials we can't imagine. Yet we have to accept the fact that the civilization is no longer with us, that it was lost. But why was it lost? This video, we're not seeking to point the finger at any particular group of people, because the theories that we're going to propose involve what happened with the previous civilization. And I believe that we do far too much of trying to blame one particular group of people for why we're in the situation we're in. We're going to look at three options, and the first one is we made it happen. The corruption that is inherent within human beings, and many of the myth stories that we have say that we grew too arrogant in our abilities. It's possible this same aspect could have struck the previous civilization. They attempted to do something using their science or their balance of science with nature to go even further in their capabilities. And in the prospect of doing so, they created a great disaster. Was this disaster some combination of natural and artificial forces that brought about some sort of plasma rain that destroyed the entire civilization? We have many accounts of what appear to be meteorites, although we know they could have many different explanations, striking cities, whether it's Sodom and Gomorrah or whether it's the Peshtigo fire that may have had something to do with what happened to Chicago. We just don't know. We don't know exactly where these events happened in history, and yet at the same time, there are far too many accounts of this to truly ignore. There are far too many images of this to ignore. So we go back to the explanation that it was simply us. Our pride grew with our ability. We saw what a great civilization that we could build. We saw our achievements, and we wanted to see how far we could actually take it. Then we also consider the other stories that we have of a great deluge or a massive flood. Now we'll be told that this flood was caused by some deity, and it may well have been. Yet there's other accounts that say that a deluge may have destroyed a civilization, such as the legend of Atlantis, because, again, it grew corrupt in the fact that all they pursued were their abilities, and wanting to expand their abilities beyond what they knew were their limits. And as a result of that, it caused the destruction of their civilization in a way that they weren't able to recover from. And this doesn't just appear from myth, but we also see this reflected in fiction, science fiction, and fantasy today. Think of the stories of old Valyria from the Song of Ice and Fire and how it was destroyed. It was all from the same cause, because the people and the civilization grew corrupt internally, and they sought to expand themselves beyond their natural bounds, and they paid a heavy price for it. Then there's also the concept of conflict, and perhaps the previous civilization simply broke down. The once great threads that were so strong that held that civilization together fell apart. They had achieved too much, and as we always see reflected in our current civilization, there was one group that felt that it was more important than another group and exploited whatever minor or major differences. Ultimately, if we think about it, there are very few differences between human beings. And yet at the same time, those same differences could have been exploited in the past for those seeking power. It is again a recurring theme and a recurring story that we have to face. It's not perhaps the most inspiring of stories, but it is true that this could have been how Tartaria fell, that the civilization had reached its ascendant over hundreds or even thousands of years, and finally it began to fall apart, because they had expanded themselves too far, or they had simply been around to the point where some people believe they could have more. Theory 2, we were corrupted to make it happen. We have many allusions to the fact that there are corruptions within human beings that could have happened from some external force that we can't fully understand. There's a lot of evidence for this in the fact that in our myth and even to contemporary times, we see that the greatest battle seems to be for a person's soul. And it's not just a plug line. There's so much effort that's put into influencing people what to do, what to think, and what to believe. As though we wish to deny people their true individuality and give them an individuality through some other sort of belief set. We have to wonder if this isn't something that's imposed by some sort of external force that we don't fully understand. Because it always seems that in myth and even in fantasy and other accounts, the greatest stories of the greatest civilizations always fall because they become internally corrupted or decadent. Now, this varies from the first theory, and the first theory that we just believe that this is completely internal and this is just human nature. Whereas the second theory indicates that this is some sort of external force that somehow manages to exploit the natural aspects of human existence and ultimately turn human beings against one another. We have other images where we see once corrupted human beings begin to fight each other and they begin to destroy their civilization. They believe that they are acting in the name of righteousness, they are righting past wrongs, or they are simply acting in the name of their survival. And yet every time we have so many stories, and it's such a repeated and recurring story, where we see the people more than willing to inflict horrific acts against one another, all in the name of righteousness. We see that buildings are destroyed, and much, much worse, so many people are killed, all because others are told that it needed to happen. It was necessary. And how many people ever stop and simply ask a simple question as to why they are told to do such actions? Oftentimes we look at the vast levels of indoctrination. And yet in these images we see what can happen when people are motivated to this extent. We see the great human spirit suddenly applied to something very malevolent, and done so without any hesitation, time and time again. We also see this depicted so many times in movies, plots, stories, novels, in our myth. It's all over the place. Until finally, the civilization reaches a point to where it's so corrupted that the internal and the external forms of human beings no longer resemble human beings. They resemble some sort of creature. Now, is this really a physical representation of what happened, or is this just simply an interpretation of people corrupting themselves, that this is what they would look like if you were able to see how they were corrupted? We don't see human beings anymore. We see ghastly apparitions all over the land. And we see the fact that there's no limits to what they're willing to do. They are completely and totally overwhelmed and controlled by their simple desire to survive and to consume anything and everything that is around them. And it's a story that's repeated so many times. And here we see the final transformation of human beings into these horrific creatures. There's many different names for them: demons, dark angels, horrific apparitions that we can't even begin to imagine. Yet it appears in every single society. It appears in every single myth that this can happen to human beings to where they can become corrupted. You'll see slight variations in what the names are for these creatures or the processes by which this happens. And yet when we step far enough back and we look at this in totality, we see that this is the exact same story, repeated time and time again. And I believe there's a lot of strong evidence for this theory, that there are forces that seek to corrupt us, both as individuals, as groups, and overall as a society. And then finally, the third theory: Tartaria was destroyed by an external force. There are many different accounts from both myth, legend, and fiction where we have some sort of dark, malevolent entity that comes from the outside and that it wishes to impose its will on humanity. We see this reflected perhaps in the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's world, where we see the original Valar, one of the great deities, who had been corrupted and sought to corrupt the natural order of the world, and dedicated his entire existence to corrupting the world. It's very possible that our lands in the distant past could have been subjected to such an external force that sought to destroy the existing civilization. It is possible that that's what could have been inflicted on the previous civilization of Tartaria. That some sort of external force accessing the lands, whether it was through some sort of portal, some sort of interdimensional nexus where there was travel between dimensions or other lands. It sounds far-fetched, and yet at the same time we have so many different indications through many different perspectives that indicate that this is indeed possible. And it does give credibility to the fact that there could have been some sort of external force that attacked the previous civilization, targeting its cities and attempting to overcome it through an external existential battle, utilizing forces and means which we can't possibly understand, given the level of destruction that we see across the lands. Or perhaps it's some combination of these three theories. Perhaps all aspects play a significant part in what caused the fall of Tartaria. There was internal corruption that was inherent because the civilization had been around so long. There was an external force that attempted to attack it physically, but was defeated by the strength of the civilization. So the external force changed its approach. It changed its approach to corrupt the people from within. And we have to ask the question, does that corruption still exist to this day? Is it really the fact that human beings are born to be something inspiring, to achieve great things? Yet time and time again we see how they are corrupted by the purposes of others. And perhaps there's some malevolent entity that we can't fully understand. My theory comes from Neverwhere Land. There's a segment in the 1981 Canadian animated film called Heavy Metal, and this segment was called Neverwhere Land. It's a segment that did not appear in the final film. But just to summarize, this is one of the most disturbing segments you'll ever see, and I'll put the link in the description of the video. In Neverwhere Land, we see the malevolent entity called the Lok-Nar, an entity that doesn't belong on the land that suddenly arrives. It influences and corrupts all the life forms in the land to destroy each other. And in a segment that only lasts 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and even though the animation isn't complete, you get a very dark, unsettling, and terrific feeling that overcomes you whenever you watch this segment. It's very difficult to watch, and I believe the reason that it is difficult to watch is because it accurately depicts what truly can happen to human beings time and time again when they become corrupted internally, when they suddenly find themselves willing to do horrific acts, all in the name of doing righteousness. And I will warn you, this is a very upsetting segment to watch, and it's very difficult. But it does accurately depict what can happen, and we certainly have so many examples within whatever history you happen to believe of events like this occurring. And that's probably why it's so upsetting and disturbing to watch, because we can't deny that what we're seeing in this 3-minute animated segment that wasn't even complete, that causes us to feel self-reflection, realizing what we could be truly capable of. We have the ability for greatness, but that's why it's so important that we ask questions and we understand ourselves. That's why I believe it is important that we're willing to explore ourselves and willing to face all the challenges of life, whatever the reality of existence is, with our own perspectives intact. Not unduly influenced by the forces of others, whether it's some malevolent entity or it's something that's simply trying to twist us to serve its own purposes. It's most important that we know who we are, and that's where I find we have the greatest hope for the future. Thank you for joining me. Consider joining the channel as a member. You can be an explorer and receive early access to content, or you can be a Prime Explorer and have exclusive content that you can't watch on the regular channel. As always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe.